Before we start this tutorial, I have a quick announcement. I just released a new Skillshare class where I'll be painting this picnic basket. Due to the complexity of this painting, I've divided this class into short painting sessions, and you can separate either on the daily or just separate the time during the day where you can treat each item as its own painting. This is actually the approach that I tried to do as I was filming this painting. I took breaks in between as I painted each item, and I felt like I had more concentration generally, and I ended up enjoying the process way more than usual because treating each item as its own kind of gave me more willingness to put in more effort individually. And I feel like this could benefit for some of you who might get overwhelmed or intimidated by the amount of information you have to take in to complete more complex paintings such as this. And if this sounds fun for you guys, please join me on Skillshare. You can go to the link in my description box for a free 1-month premium membership, and I hope to see you guys there. Hi everyone, this is Nia, and today I'm going to be painting this hidden door. This is based off a picture that I took when I was hiking in Graz, and it was actually in the middle of winter, but everything was still so green, so I decided to use it as reference for today's painting. Like usual with these types of paintings, I began by masking the sides, and because the composition itself is very straightforward, I'm just going to sketch it very quickly just to indicate the placement and spacing for the door and plants surrounding it. So this is the reference image that I took. What I want to take note of here is where the lightest areas of the plants are and where the darkest parts are going to be. As for the door, because it requires a lot of straight lines, I just ended up using a ruler to make sure that everything is completely straight and evenly divided. At first, I tried to include drawing the lightest areas for the leaves, but then I thought that I'm just going to freehand it and it's going to be much easier to paint that way. And that's all I'm going to sketch out for my base. Next, I'm going to go over the colors. Paint Spray Bluish by Schmincke, Sepia by Holbein, Aquarius Green by Szmal, Hansa Yellow Medium by Daniel Smith, Vermilion by Holbein, Cerrulean Blue by Holbein, Cobalt Blue Hue by Hobein, Titanium Gold Ochre by Schmincke, and of course Bleed Proof White by Dr. P.H. Martens. So let's begin to paint. I'm going to start by painting the door. For this, I use a mix of Titanium Gold Ochre with Cerulean Blue to create this muted sage green. And I'm just using a watery load here and painting vertically following the wooden grain of the door. Sometimes I like to use Titanium Gold Ochre by itself, and I alternate between the green mix or just Cerulean Blue to get some variations of color. But I'm doing this while the surface is still wet, so the colors will just mingle with each other. With the Cerulean Blue, since it's slightly darker in value than the rest of the colors, I'd like to place it in between the smaller slits of the door. I'm not sure if you can see it from the reference image, but there are some layers to the wood where some are a bit more forwards while some are further back. I'm just going to paint all over the door while leaving out the door handle. At this point, it doesn't really have to be neat. I'm not even worried if I go over the pencil lines since I'm just trying to establish the placement of all the colors. Next, I'm going to paint the base color of the surrounding greenery, starting with the part on the right hand side. I'm using a mix of Aquarius Green and Payne Spray Bluish to create a dark green value, but I'm still using a light load and a watery consistency in order to give myself a rough estimation just to place those values down. For this area on the right, as you can see from the reference, there's a bit of the same green wood peeking through the greeneries with the same material and color as the door. That's why I left out some white part so I can fill it in with the same color as the door. Now I'm going to move to the greeneries at the top. I'm going to begin by using a mix of Aquarius Green with Hansa Yellow to create a really light yellow-green to paint some of the lighter areas of the plants. This is still with a very light and watery load, so the paint can spread out quickly, covering a lot of space. To change the tone to make it darker and darker, I will just keep adding Aquarius green to the mix. And as for the darkest areas, I would add Payne's Gray Bluish to the Aquarius green. But I'm just going to very roughly follow the reference image here and try to place the lighter and the darker values by tapping my brush using those colors. Here I'm also going to do the same thing for the left-hand side. I want to leave out the bottom of the door empty since I'm going to use brown to fill in that color, as you can see from the reference image. Once I've covered the whole area surrounding the door, I'm going to start building on the darker values, especially where the shadows are framing the top of the door, by using a mix of Payne's Gray Bluish with Aquarius green. And in this application, I start to use a slightly lighter load so I can start to create the leafy textures without the paint spreading too much. As I was trying to add more paint, I can tell that those whole area is still very wet, so I'm going to just let that settle for a while and move on to paint the bottom of the door. For the stairs below the door, I'm going to use a mix of Hansa Yellow with Vermilion to create an orange. Then I'm going to mix it with a dark green mix to create a brown color. Once I'm done, I'm going to paint the door again since the base color should be dry by now. I'm just going to use the same colors, but this time the load on my brush is much lighter, so I can control the flow a bit more and I can paint per section. As you can see, I tried to paint in between the wooden planks so the paint won't run into each other too quickly since they have a bit more time to settle and dry. For the areas protruding outwards, I'm using the lighter mix, then I'm going to follow it up using cerulean blue to paint the areas in between using a smaller brush. The concept is still more or less the same. I'm still painting vertically to create the wooden texture, and as you can see, the colors that I have chosen are a bit different than the reference image, but I don't really mind since the goal here is just to get a different tone of green than what I'm using to paint the surrounding foliage. I'm also going to do the same for the wooden area peeking through the right hand side of the foliage, and I'm also using the same mix in a medium consistency. The door is looking a bit too yellow at the moment, so here I'm going back in with the green mix, which is from Cerulean Blue and Titanium Gold Ochre, and I'm painting on light streaks so there's a bit more texture. Now I'm going to move back to the foliage since everything is completely dry now. And I'm going to start painting on the lighter leaves. For this, I use a mix of Aquarius green and Hansa Yellow. I'm just individually painting on the leaves on the lighter areas using the light green. And as for the darker areas, I would use a darker green mix, which is the same mixture but with more Aquarius green. Here I'm trying to paint more leaves surrounding the door so I can sort of try to figure out how to frame it nicely. Instead of just painting only leaves, if you want to extend some of the leaves, you can also paint the stem, and this would also add a bit more delicate touch to the painting. Before I do anything else to the foliage, I want to finish up the door first. So here I'm going back to layer on a bit more detail. This time I'm painting on a completely dry surface, and this time I'm using my smaller brush. I want to make sure each section are clearly divided. So here I'm just aligning the darker areas in between the wooden planks using the same mix as before, but this time I added a bit of Payne's Gray Bluish just to darken the tone a bit more. With this set though, I don't want it to be too dark because I don't want it to fight with the values of the surrounding foliage later, so I'm using a medium to light consistency. Once I'm done lining the door, I'm going to use the same mixture as before. And here I'm using a really light consistency and also very light brush load that's almost a dry brush to paint on more streaks very thinly to show a bit more of that wooden texture. I'm going to go back to the leaves again, and this time I'm using a slightly darker green to paint behind the leaves that I've already painted. But what I'm trying to do here is just to fill in more of the space. Going back to the step before, I'm just going to add more of the darker leaves where the darker areas are and adding lighter leaves where the lighter areas are. I'm painting the leaves a few at a time, and I'm definitely trying to not make them touch each other or else they're just going to blend into each other, creating a giant blob. So as you can see, I'm jumping from place to place. At the bottom here, I decided to make the leaves slightly different by making them larger and more rounded, and I'm just basically trying to layer them a little at a time. So as you can see here, I'm going back in with the darker green to paint behind the leaves that I've already painted, and I'm just going to try to do this as much as I can. Just like the reference, I tried to make the leaves much smaller on this area so I can fill in the space while leaving out a bit of that wooden texture instead of creating one giant bush of foliage. By the way, in terms of the leaf shapes, I try to just paint with whatever leaf shape that I'm comfortable with. If you have a specific leaf shape that you're used to painting, just stick with that since we're going to paint a lot of them. So just make sure that it's comfortable for you to just keep repeating. As you can see now, I'm starting to use an even darker value here to paint behind the leaves that I've already painted, and I'm placing them at the darkest areas of the base color. This doesn't have to be 100% exact though, since we kind of just painted blobs as the base color, so if you want to fix certain areas or move the darker colors into another area, that's also okay. So I'm just going to keep working on it until I have a pretty good amount of leaves. In some areas, it's also okay to just smudge a whole area and paint some leaves surrounding that area. And this will be enough visually for us to know that it's a depiction of a group of leaves. This actually makes the painting itself look a bit more loose and dynamic and not too overly busy where your eyes are just focusing on every single leaf shape. So as I'm painting, I try to mix and match the blobs with other leaf shapes, and maybe some leaves are not even as clear as others. But even the amount that I'm painting here should be enough for our eyes to know that those are supposed to be a bunch of green foliage surrounding the door. But I'm just going to keep painting more leaves on, especially the darker ones, to slowly build the layers and the values so there's much more depth in the painting. Notice after having a good amount, I start using the really dark green color, which is from a mix of Payne's Grey Bluish and Aquarius green. But this is all about balance, so after I've done the darker values, now I'm going to go back to the lighter ones until I like the overall vibrancy as well as the depth of the painting. The consistency also helps with getting the different values. So say if you want the darker tone, but you don't want the value to be too dark, you can still use the same color in a lighter consistency, then build up the value and the depth by using a thicker consistency. In the beginning, I used more of a thin consistency, especially to paint the lighter leaves. And what I'm doing now is moving to more of a medium to thick consistency. And this is something that I'm going to keep building up until I have a good contrast in value. On the left side here, I felt like the leaves look a little bit too busy and there's just too many of them. So I decided to smudge parts of it using the darker color and also just paint over those areas. So what we're doing here is adding detail and also taking away detail if parts are looking a bit too busy and crowded. I feel like I have a pretty good amount of the lighter values here, so I'm going to now add the darker values surrounding those areas to make the lighter leaves pop out a little bit more. For some of the lighter leaves, you have the choice of painting surrounding the lighter leaves, so you're basically painting the negative space of those lighter leaves that you've already painted at the beginning. But just like before, if parts, especially the mid-tone greens, are looking a bit too busy and too detailed and it's taking away from the lighter leaves, you can also paint over it, taking away some of the details and smudging areas which you want to take away. I think I have a good amount of leaves here, and the darker values made the whole painting look a bit more lush. So now I'm going to move on to paint the shadow underneath the leaves, especially at the top of the door. For this, I'm actually using the same dark green mix, which is from Payne's Grey Bluish and Aquarius green, but with much more Payne's Grey Bluish in the mix, and I'm using a medium to heavy consistency just to paint underneath the leaves. Then I follow it up with a clean damp brush to pull the paint downwards, and this will create a softer edge for the shadows. I first pulled the color for the dips in the door so that stays darker than the rest, and once those dips dries off, then I pull the darker colors to soften the edge of the shadows on the larger wooden boards. After painting on the shadows, I felt like I've smudged some of the leaves surrounding the door, so I'm just going to add more of the darker colors to redefine some of the leaves. I'm also going to reline the steps underneath the door. For this, I used the brown mix that I already had on my palette with added sepia and also a bit of the Payne's Grey Bluish to darken it. And still using the brown, I'm going to add bleed-proof white, titanium gold ochre, Hansa Yellow, and a bit of vermilion to create this golden color for the door handle. After painting it on though, I felt like the edges weren't clean enough, so I decided to go over it again with bleed-proof white to get the clean edges. I am also going to wait for this to dry before painting right on top of it. So meanwhile, I'm going to add some flowers on the right hand side here. I'm just using a thick consistency of bleed-proof white to paint some simple white flowers. For the flowers, I'm going to play around with the angle as well as the size, especially when it's in the inner part near the door. I try to make the flower face the door as if the flower is curving with the placement of the leaves, which I find helps give the illusion of the thick foliage framing the door. As for the center of the flower, I'm just going to use a mix of vermilion and Hansa Yellow to create this orange, and I'm using a very thick consistency so the color will pop against the greens. Now I'm going to go back to the door handle, in which I used a bit of the brown that I already had on my palette, and I decided this time that I'm going to mix it with the orange. This way the color is a little bit darker. Then I follow this up using a bit of sepia to paint the edges of the door handle very thinly to give more dimension to the shape. As for the shadow, I used the same dark green mix as before with added sepia in a very thin consistency. Now I'm going to go back to paint more flowers. This time I decided to create a different type of flower. I want the petals to be larger, and it's going to be a 5-petaled flower which has wider petals than the ones before. And I'm going to paint this mostly facing upwards and to the side, following again the curvature of the flower bush. Just like the previous flower, I used bleed-proof white to paint this one. But after it's completely dry, I'm going to follow it up using a mix of bleed-proof white with a bit of Hansa Yellow to create this really light yellow color. Then I'm going to follow it up using a medium to thin consistency of the orange mix from before to paint parts of the petals. I'm going to wait for the colors to dry and move on to paint more of those small flowers using the same method as before. And using my small brush, I'm going to pick up whatever green I have left on my palette and use a very light load so I can create really thin lines to paint some of the veins and the midrib of the larger leaves. I'm also going to add the midribs of the other leaves if they're still in full shape. Once I'm done, I'm going to move back to the larger flowers to paint the center. For this, I used a mix of Hansa Yellow, Vermilion, as well as Sepia to create this orangey brown, and I'm using a thick consistency to paint just dots as the center. Then I used the dark green mix from earlier and paint some shadows to separate the flowers and the leaves if the values are too close together. Here I'm going to define the shadows using a thick consistency of Payne's Gray Bluish, and I'm just going to use the same method as before by pulling the rest of the paint downwards, but I really want the top part to be nice and dark, especially against the lighter leaves as well as the flowers. Here I've used a mix of bleed-proof white with the yellow-green mix from earlier, and I'm going to paint some lighter leaves on top of the darker ones that I've already painted. I just felt like this needs some extra pop of color from the lighter leaves. I just find that this makes the edges of the leaves a little bit more defined, especially against those darker shadows. I forgot to mention earlier, but for some of the flowers which are against the darker parts of the foliage, I tried to smudge it a bit to lighten the color so the flowers look like it's in shadow. After this, I'm just going to do some final adjustments like fixing the contrast in values and so on. As a final touch-up, I also decided to add some extra loose vines using the bleed-proof white and light green mix, but this is completely optional. I just find that this gives a bit more movement to the painting. After that, I'm just going to keep adding some final adjustments like adding shadows for some of the leaves which needs a bit more redefinition, and I'm also going to darken the bottom of the stairs. I feel like I can take off the masking tape, so I'm just going to peel it off to reveal the painting. I'm going to clean up some of the edges using bleed-proof white, and I also decided to add more flowers in shadow, so I'm using a light consistency of the bleed-proof white. And that's pretty much it for this painting. Like usual, all the list of tools as well as my social media links will be in my description box. If you guys like what you see here, please consider subscribing. Thank you so much for watching till the end, and I'll see you at the next one. Bye!